Good evening. Hello, welcome. And of course, the very first thing I need to do is to thank you for still being here after this delay and some very difficult moments. I so appreciate you staying and being here, and I apologize for the delay and also the stress and fear that all the events of the past hour may have caused. So we're really delighted to have you here, and I think it's going to be a wonderful evening nevertheless. And hopefully you are able to enjoy the refreshments, and that will give you a little food for the soul as you weather this. So I want to welcome you to the 2025 Paul and Dorothy Grob Memorial Lecture. My name is Jennifer Geddes, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program here at UVA. The children of Paul and Dorothy Grob, inspired by their parents' dedication, endowed the Paul and Dorothy Grob Memorial Lecture Series at the University of Virginia in their memory. Every spring, the Jewish Studies program invites an eminent scholar to Charlottesville to deliver a community-wide presentation on important issues relating to Jewish American life. And we're really pleased to have the Grob family here, Dr. Mayer Grob, Dr. Taryn Tor, along with their daughters, Gabrielle, Lauren, and Jessica, here with us tonight. So thank you for all of your support for Jewish Studies and for this memorial lecture. We celebrated the 10th anniversary of the lecture series, or the lecture series last year, and we're so pleased that it continues. After the lecture this evening, I was going to invite you to stay and enjoy our catered reception. I still will, but there's less of a reception to enjoy. But there still looks like maybe lemonade. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Riv-Ellen Prell, a professor emerita of American Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she also led the departments of Women's Studies and the Center for Jewish Studies. Dr. Prell is a cultural anthropologist whose research and books have been path-breaking in focusing on the everyday lives of American Jews and changed the way Jewish life in the United States is studied. This influence began with her first book, Prayer and Community, The Haburah in American Judaism, which was the result of months of fieldwork among American Jews. Her work has also been groundbreaking in focusing on issues of gender in American Jewish life, evidenced in both her co-edited volume, Women's Lives, Feminist Theory and Personal Narratives, and her book, Fighting to Become Americans, Jews, Gender, and the Anxiety of Assimilation. She was also the organizer of a widely discussed and attended exhibit in 2017 entitled A Campus Divided, Progressives, Anti-Communists, Racism, and Antisemitism at the University of Minnesota from 1930 to 1942. Dr. Prell has been the recipient of multiple awards, including Lifetime Achievement Awards, and we are honored to host her tonight for the Paul and Dorothy Grob Memorial Lecture entitled A New Era of Cultural Vitality of American Jews. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Riv-Ellen Prell.
Thank you, Professor Geddes, for such a kind and lovely introduction. So this has been a little unnerving because of a campus lockdown, and I feel very fortunate that I'm still able to be with you. For any of you who may actually be here on the YouTube channel, not quite understanding why you were late, we want to welcome you as well. So I want to thank UVA and the Grob family for inviting me. It's always an honor to honor the memory of one's parents and grandparents. I'm certainly very grateful to Professor Geddes, to Professor James Loeffler, and to Professor Vanessa Oakes, all of whom have invited me to give some version of this lecture over, believe it or not, 4 different occasions. So we're here, and I want to thank Abigail Snyder for all her help in this event, and I especially want to thank Harrison not only for his work with me on the PowerPoints, but because of his deep understanding of people, which is you feed them before they get hungry and making it very difficult for them to to enjoy an evening. Tonight, I will be reflecting on some of the most dramatic changes that have shaped the life of American Jews since October 7th, 2023. And how, given how recent these events are, I find myself going out on some limbs in this conversation with you because of trying to understand in real time the complexity of these changes. I hope you will not only understand my doing that, especially the limb part, but to be part of a conversation about how you're making sense of this and that we can listen respectfully to one another, anticipating there will be disagreements, but that it's worth it to try at this point. So this is like the olden days of art history. I'm going to say, next slide. So this may feel a little bit like a class in which you outline what you're doing, but I thought you might find it helpful to understand the direction that I'll be going. I'm going to begin briefly with talking about what I'm calling challenges to Jewish cultural scripts for dealing with political and cultural trauma, American responses to the war in Gaza, how American Jewish life changed, and that's where my question comes from. Is there a new vitality? And then I'm going to talk about what I'm calling two alternative narratives, one about American Jewish practices and connections, and one about, very briefly, about campus protests. And if I can manage all that in 45 minutes, I will be happy. So let's go to the first issue. We can keep this up for a minute, which is the challenges to the cultural scripts. Why do I use the term cultural script? In part because I'm an anthropologist interested in public life and certainly all groups, public and cultural life, and Jews in particular. As we, of course, all know, on October 7th, 2023, Israel experienced the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, in which more than 1,200 were murdered, 240 taken hostage, a terrorist attack from Hamas, which at that point Israel had claimed had been pacified and would not be of danger. This created a tremendous sense of vulnerability in several senses. One, that Israel, within Israel and beyond it, and certainly in North America, has typically been viewed as invincible, especially since the Six-Day War, and that it turned out they were clearly unprepared despite warning. This seemed unimaginable. And at the core of Zionist ideology, and I mean that in the modern Jewish sense of what we mean by Zionism as a political movement and ideology, it is fundamentally predicated on the idea that Jews would be safe in Israel. And that's why there had to be a Jewish homeland, and they weren't. And so those two devastating blows, in addition to this horrific slaughter, was extremely unnerving, and not only in Israel certainly, but throughout the world for Jews, truly traumatic, and I use the word purposely. So what do I mean by a cultural script? It's certainly shared by many groups in the face of attack, particularly terrorism. And that is, these are public events of mourning whose purpose is to recognize the event, the trauma, the loss, and to create solidarity among people who mark it. It acts to unify people, to stop isolation, which comes with these kinds of attacks, to demonstrate alliances well beyond the individuals or groups who are under attack. It asserts shared values and common interests. Think of 9/11 in the United States, which is a profound example of what a traumatized city and nation felt, and what memorialization, gatherings throughout the United States and beyond meant. And I don't have to tell people in Charlottesville, Virginia, what it means to experience up close from the Unite the Right rally here in 2017 about what it meant to be confronted with white supremacists and the murder and attack on a protester. Of course, there may be dissent. There were celebrations in Arab countries after 9/11, but those are out there. What the public purpose is to be together within. In American Jewish communal life, these scripts are especially well elaborated because they happen not in the face of immediate trauma, but all through the year. Holocaust Memorial Day, Israel Independence Day, many, many events that repeat and are like one another, that is part of the normal course of the year. They, for example, occurred after the October 28 mass killing of 11 congregants at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, perpetrated by a white supremacist. These events always cross religious and secular lives. They're typically held in synagogues, but they have small religious components, but they are not primarily religious. They are ethnic, they are secular, and they are religious. And they always include civic leaders who are not Jewish or are incidentally Jewish, if they are governors, if they are mayors, if they're other kinds of religious leaders, who attest to the fact that Jews belong here. Jews are part of normal American life. They belong in society. The attack on Israel was certainly unique for its horror, for its immensity, and what emerged as the remarkable place of hostages in North America, in Israel, and elsewhere. But it still had that public dimension. But what I would suggest is that this cultural script certainly succeeded initially, but it was immediately challenged in two very unprecedented ways in Jewish North American communal life. With the war in Gaza, which was announced by Defense Minister Gallant on October 9th, the script, what I'm calling the cultural script of Jewish life, was continuously challenged. And who was the victims and who were the perpetrators continued and today continue to be contested. Jews felt abandoned by former allies in various religious and ethnic groups, the NAACP, liberal Protestants over the first year, who had typically stood alongside at other points. But second of all, the script was undermined by a visible Jewish presence who blamed Israel, who undermined that critical sense of unity, and who did it as Jews. Jews for the Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now. And I'm going to show you two slides. First, go ahead, sorry. The first is from the gathering of Jews on the Mall in Washington, D.C., where there were 200,000 people, and same script. Outsiders were there, including a very well-known evangelical minister who stood up and spoke, civic leaders, Jewish leaders, religious and secular. A month later, the next slide will show you that there were 300,000 people marching together in favor of Palestinian rights, and again that flipped script of who's the perpetrator and who is the victim. So immediately and in unprecedented ways in the United States, two dueling narratives around Israel and Palestine disrupt what I'm calling a cultural script. The events of October 7th also occurred in the context of growing anti-Semitism in the US, but also worldwide. Anti-Semitism is an indisputable fact. Its being on the rise is as well, and it too creates a massive shift in cultural scripts about how people respond and what their claims are. Let me show you something about, in the next slide, about a study done by the Jewish Federations of the United States. These are attitude studies. These are what people themselves experience, which is not the only way that anti-Semitism is measured, and I'll tell you other ways. How many people experience themselves to be the target of anti-Semitism personally? How many have seen or overheard anti-Semitic comments? And how many people experience themselves as targets of anti-Semitism but did not report these incidents? So we are tracking by self-statement about what it feels like to be a Jew in North America in the 21st century. That is not the only way anti-Semitism is monitored. It's also monitored online. and not just by Jewish organizations, but by groups who study extremism on the internet, not just since October 7th, but for years. The internet chatter from the right, from the people who wanted to spend time in Charlottesville, Virginia, with those of you who were there then, has gone through the roof. It is unparalleled compared to almost any group. So what was very much part of the landscape of American life and American Jewish life that I think will be very familiar to you and that we will not resolve tonight, but I will speak a little bit about the end, is what is anti-Semitism and what is anti-Zionism? Are they the same? Can people hold some attitudes and not others? What does that mean on the campus? What did this mean elsewhere? So this flipped script, the failure of coming together and transforming, was there immediately. It remains present for Jews and others in terms of the persistence and growth of anti-Semitism and the tremendous sense by surveys of how unsafe Jews feel. And the more identified they are as Jews, meaning the more particularly Orthodox men whose clothing is visible, how much more they feel and are at risk. So I'm going to now move to my second point, which was about the American response to the war in Gaza and the Hamas attack on the first year, which was shattering and powerful. And just to serve as a very quick spine, so that we're sort of on the same timeline, if not page, and this is in no way remarks about the war, what happened in the war, but simply to give you the dateline. We know the attack happens 2023, October 7th. We know October 9th, Gallant announces the complete siege of the Gaza Strip. On November 22nd, there was a pause for the release of hostages and a ceasefire, which, of course, we were very hopeful would hold and did not. The expanded war and Israeli success in this war on multiple fronts was completely unanticipated, including by the leadership of the United States, allowing it to continue. It was regional, and it is in this context, almost immediately, but in growing ways, that accusations and counter-accusations of genocide, war crimes grow that way. As you know, of course, in January of 2025, there was a negotiated ceasefire, which we are still in the middle of. What will happen to the second phase is anyone's guess. But the most recent estimate of deaths in Gaza from Lancet, which is as they call it, a peer-reviewed, highly regarded scholarly journal, is that there have been about 70,000 deaths in Gaza by January of 2025, over half of whom are women and children. Now, there are endless conversations about the conduct of the war by Hamas, by what's a civilian, by all of these issues. Happy to tell you that's not what we're talking about tonight. But it is to give you kind of a sense of the response. This war has become so deeply embedded in American life and reactions to it that I was shocked to learn in doing research that by December 5th, 2024, the estimates are that more than 1 million people, Americans, have participated in a protest over the conflict across more than 2,600 events. And I have a little slide that's going to show you these proportions. 442 of those were in support of Israel. 2,100 of them were in support of Palestinians. About 100 by May 20th of 2024, over 100 local city councils passed resolutions of condemnation of Israel. And these came with demands. The demonstrations came with demands. The city council resolutions came with demands. They were demands to immediately stop American dollars by Congress to support weapons for Israel, to sell weapons for Israel, or to continue aid. The long-standing movement called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions against Israel that began in 2000, that I'm sure you're very familiar with on university campuses, which calls on universities, churches, labor unions, cities to remove any investment in Israel, to stop all cultural exchanges, to exclude Israeli scholars from publishing in scholarly journals. It's a complete attack that was part of many city council resolutions, and as well in these massive demonstrations of the kind that you thought about. And of course, and if we can have the next slide, the campus protests began immediately after October 7th, including those that blamed Israel for the massacre within 24 hours, so that they were certainly just beginning. And, oops, can we go back one? Well, I had a slide that somehow I managed not to include, but it was just a visualization of the fact that by the spring of 2024, campus protests took place in 45 to 50 states in the United States, that 140 different campuses saw demonstrations, some occupations of building as recently as yesterday at Barnard College, and that there have been arrests. And in addition to the demands I just described to you, these called for breaking ties with Israeli universities, not allowing students to go to Israel to study, to support and pay for Palestinian students from Gaza to be able to come to American universities to study. So, as you can tell looking at my gray hair, I was a student during the war in Vietnam era. I know a lot about campus demonstrations, as I'm sure others in this room do. But these demonstrations are very unique. The most striking difference between these demonstrations and really any other in the student movement since the 1960s forward, through environmental, through ending apartheid in South Africa, have always been students versus administrators, students and faculty versus administrators, students and faculty versus faculty and administrators. This is the first really active demonstration that pitted students against students. It's true during the war in Vietnam. There were ROTC students, there were some very conservative students. George W. Bush was at Yale during this time, but he just didn't participate. And there were lots of people who did not participate. But there was always a tiny conservative presence, a massive, unified student voice. And this is not the case in these last 2 years, in which there is conflict between students, among faculty, and everybody doesn't like the administration. So that's pretty standard. Campus protests, in turn, mobilized a massive response from outside campus. And I think people sort of know about this intuitively, but really not enough, and I'm really not going to have enough time to talk about that, which I would love to, because it's a very powerful part of the landscape of higher education today. So immediately, parental groups formed through social media, of course, mobilized to complain to administrators, most prominently a group called Mothers Against Antisemitism, who have become a major political force in higher education. Jewish alumni groups formed that immediately organized around withdrawing very generous financial contributions, especially to the Ivy League, but in much smaller or public universities as well. The Anti-Defamation League, an organization on the campus of Brandeis University, the Brandeis Center for the Study of Antisemitism, have become major figures at the government level, at the political level, and on campus. And of course, this has become a part of partisan American politics. And on December 5th of 2023, Virginia Fox's committee brought before her university presidents. You never hear about my colleague, Pamela Nadell, a Jewish studies scholar who also spoke, and nobody covered what she had to say. But it became extremely politicized between Republicans and Democrats. So these protests are what I call increasingly a social field, bringing many, many, many different groups together, increasing many people's sense of isolation, many Jews' sense of isolation, in part because of the very deep connection between Jews and higher education. The path to mobility that begins in the late 19th century, dealing with quotas, getting past those quotas in the 70s, a very important route to mobility and Americanization for American Jews, and also a testing ground for all Jewish radicals from the 1930s. So there's this push and pull about higher education. So in the face of what many American Jews experienced as this extremely traumatic attack on Israel, and rising anti-Semitism, and massive campus unrest, dissent, unprecedented, there are a number of commentators, thinkers, whatever we want to call them, who began noting that Jewish life in America, so often seen in decline, was becoming, in fact, a very different thing. It was getting vitality. Galloping assimilation, which is how most people look at American Jewish life today, seemed to be changing course. And Jews seem to be experiencing the world differently. And this is background to talking to you about what I have really found as so interesting in conversations about this. Let me just say, as a sidebar, speaking as someone who studies the social science and history of American Jews, the entire narrative from the 19th century forward of how people have talked about American Jews is defined by one word: decline. It's always falling short of Europe, of traditional schools of knowledge, of high levels of observing mitzvot. And then as Jews begin to acculturate and become more successful, and after World War II with suburbanization, there's a boom in the building of synagogues. People are going to synagogue in part because the way you knew for sure that someone was a communist was they weren't going to church. So this was a nice high point. Jews are finally turning out, showing up, and then what is the new accusation of decline? Yeah, but they don't really mean it. Or they belong and they don't go on Shabbat. Or they send their kids to school, but they don't really do it. Continuing decline, continuing decline. And the social scientific study of Jews develops right after World War II. They begin to measure everything. There's a little measurement before, but it really gets serious. And they too jump on the bandwagon of decline, in part by measuring Jewish practices, but then the very shocking statistic in American Jewish life, which was intermarriage, which spikes for the very first time. By the way, in contrast to every ethnic group that intermarried quite early, Jews really don't do that until about the mid-1960s. And then there's a critique about what intermarriage will do and how it will ruin American Jewish life. By the 70s, the decline narrative, which was by no means inaccurate, not the decline part, but is that American Jewish life begins to center around two overwhelming experiences in Jewish history, all alien to America. One is the Holocaust and the importance of Holocaust memory, and the second is Israel. That American Jews know who they are through not moving to Israel, identifying with Israel, being interested in Israel, supporting Israel financially above all. And they become absolutely crucial. Now, I have to say, in the 1990s, there was a big shift in social sciences and Jewish life itself, which began to pay attention to the fact that there were a diversity of ways to be Jewish, that they weren't all institutional, that they might have very little to do with what you observe or you don't observe, but a strong sense of identity and ethnicity. And so I give you that as a sidebar because my ears always prick a little bit when I began to hear when people are talking about, are Jews doing better or are they doing worse? Are they behaving like they should be for the future of the Jewish people, or are they still failing? And so a dear colleague of mine, a person at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Jack Wertheimer, wrote in November of 2024 a very interesting article called What American Jews Gave After October 7th. And it's an extensive review that involved interviews with 55 Jewish professionals, massive reading of blogs, listening to podcasts, various other things. And he paid attention just to two spheres, or primarily to the sphere of philanthropy, which has always been a way Jewish vitality is measured, and also Jewish association. So he learned from Federation professionals pretty remarkably that in the first weeks after October 7th, federations raised $300 million in the United States that went to 500 institutions in the state of Israel to do everything from pay for farming equipment to help the IDF to a variety of other things. And within 6 months, $833 million were raised by American Jews. That's an astonishing sum. And it says how deeply people felt about what happened, how deeply they identified with what happened, and they were willing to do this with a kind of remarkable intensity. When Wertheimer asked these professionals, why do you think this happened? Why do you think people either gave more money or people who hadn't given money in decades? And their summary was, their eyes were opened, they didn't realize how much they cared about Israel. But there was also an explosion in what we're going to talk about of Jewish belonging, how Jews felt about one another. And what was experienced has been referred to as a surge. It was named that because of a remarkable number of people doing that. And I have a few slides. We'll go to the first slide. That summarizes here in letters and numbers that since October 7th, 43%, and this is very excellent social science. This is not random, or they're not picking people. I mean, this is based on the kind of data available, done by professionals. 43% of Jews have sought or engaged in Jewish life. 25% seek connection with other Jews. 29% have said they want to learn more about Israel or Jewish life. And 23% have engaged more with the Jewish community. And then they have these cool images that I'll show you that let you look at it visually. Next slide, if you like looking at things this way. So here's what really impressed social science types. It is that the surge has taken place with the least affiliated, the least connected, not the most. And you can see along the bottom how this works. The smallest change is in highly affiliated and identified Jews. The biggest changes are with people who are not very, or barely very, or maybe never engaged at all. What the next slide shows you is, and they found this extremely important, is that this happened across every life stage, and it happened among the least likely to be involved, which is younger people and older people. And if we can have the next slide. There are my American universities that got mixed up. I apologize. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's go back. You can look at the map of American universities. But these studies are not the only ones. So for example, Hillel reports, and this will come as zero surprise to you, they have had the highest number of student participation since 2023 in a century. And that there are new, what are called Jewish outlets that exist completely outside of synagogue life or other traditional forms of association for Jews. There's an organization called One Table. Anyone ever heard about it? Oh, I'm impressed. This is an opportunity for people to sign up and get together on a Friday night. You can celebrate Shabbat, or you can play cards, or you can do games together. This is nothing other than for the purpose of association with other Jews. And there's an effort to create community this way, and people seek it out who are interested. It's now up to 180,000 participants in the largest Jewish population areas. And parents have, for example, sent their kids to Jewish summer camps in the greatest numbers since COVID. So these are a small set of examples, but very compelling ones, that suggest something is shifting, not just toward generosity, which if you're rich enough is not that hard, or even modest, but with people actually wanting to show up and being together in a surge. It's not unusual under adversity for almost any minority group to really connect to one another and to want to spend time with each other. I always, when this was happening, as people say in Hebrew, lahavdil, for the importance of the difference, but under the rise of Nazism, the Lehrhaus flourished in Berlin when Abraham Joshua Heschel was there. Jewish hiking clubs developed because they were excluded from German Aryan groups. There was, for a period of time before things got much worse, a tremendous sense, including among very assimilated, very Enlightenment German Jews, a deep search for their Jewish roots. So it's not unusual, forget Jews, for almost any group to turn to each other in these difficult times. But for many Jewish leaders, the hope is that these trends will not be simple, that they will increase Jewish participation by what I'm going to keep calling standard measures, that non-Orthodox Jews, especially millennials and Gen Z Jews, will now come back to the fold, give more philanthropy, increase their support for Israel, commit their families to Jewish education, and for some, the old saw, stop intermarriage. And all of this is promised for many of these pundits and thinkers, not Jack Wertheimer, who as a scholar is a little more concerned about what it will mean for that. So now I want to give you my first, what I called alternative narrative of American Jewish practice and connections. The surge is real, unquestionably, but as an anthropologist, I always want to dig under and wonder what terms mean, what actions mean, and what does it mean to belong to a congregation? What does it mean to say you want to be more involved? And I in a extremely unscientific way, but one that I was committed to, I interviewed 12 rabbis, both Reform and Conservative, in Los Angeles, New York City, in Manhattan and Brooklyn, in Minneapolis, in Washington, D.C., and in Charlottesville. And I put to them in the winter of 2024, no, I should say in the summer of 2024, the question, did they see vitality in their congregations? I was completely surprised by the consistency of their responses, except for 3 rabbis, amazingly, in Minneapolis, where I live, who saw very little change around them. What I found through their experiences was very much consistent with the Federation's study. Rabbis report an increased and intense desire by their congregants, by people who have never belonged to their congregation but have begun spending time with them, who wanted above all to be with other Jews, what was documented in the surge. Who was part of this surge in their communities? So they heard right away from some Jews who said they never went to synagogues. They were seeking out people who were Jews because they no longer could be part of groups that had been very important to them because they were asked to disavow Zionism. And these were, of course, as I'm sure you've heard a lot about, progressive groups, some gay, lesbian, trans, queer groups, some social justice groups, on campus, off campus. And they were really bereft, and they were trying to find ways to connect. Some simply felt that non-Jews really could not understand their fears and their vulnerabilities. One rabbi, I thought, very eloquently explained that the Jews he spoke to had so many complicated and complex feelings because they were Jewish that, and here's how he put it, they simply could not explain 100 things to the people they normally spent time with, and were looking for a place where they only had to explain 5. And he said it was like peeling back an onion. They wanted to be at the inner place of the onion and not have to deal with the outside of it. And of course, what he was alluding to, how do you explain a history of genocide and discrimination to people who aren't Jewish? How do you explain the unique connections Jews often feel with one another? How do you transmit this to people who are not Jewish? And at the same time, what most rabbis agreed upon was that the months after October 7th, stretching well to the fall of 2024, and this was true for all of them, was the single most exhausting and intense of all of their careers, and they were long careers. All of them see themselves as Zionists, so there are differences between them, and deeply, deeply committed to Israel, where all of them have spent a tremendous amount of time. But they don't all agree on the relationship between Israel and Palestine. So we're looking at people who are largely of the same mind with some important differences. Why was this so exhausting? They were dealing with congregants and others whose feelings were so intense about what had happened in Israel and about the conduct of the war in Gaza. They felt not understood. They felt huge differences between generations in their own families. And for example, a Manhattan conservative rabbi said to me, in 461 days, I can no longer count the conversations I have had with kids who can't speak to their parents, parents who can't speak to their kids, grandparents who are devastated by their grandchildren's attitude. And all they could do was agree to not talk about Israel. Like other rabbis, he spent time with kids who had grown up in his synagogue and now sought him out in college, post-college, aged adults who now completely rejected Zionism, felt entirely betrayed by their Jewish educations, their synagogue, and him. Rabbis heard not just about intergenerational tensions, but demands from congregants to respond to how the congregants felt. One Reform rabbi said that he was literally besieged with reading material, articles, newspaper reports, blogs, Facebook posts, books, from many different perspectives. All of them wanted the rabbi to read them. All of them wanted to talk to him, to discuss, to affirm, to criticize. And he said, I just couldn't do it. I mean, I have a career. I have people I have to care for in my congregation. But there was an onslaught. And a Brooklyn Reform rabbi noted, you know, it's not just kids. I have a congregant in his 60s who's a member of Jewish Voice for Peace who quit the synagogue. He said, I don't belong here any longer. What was far more consuming for these rabbis, if this wasn't enough, was the tension within their congregation over violent disagreement between members and between the members and about Israel, who was the victim, who was the perpetrator, or in between. Now, this would be very different in an Orthodox community, which I did not interview Orthodox rabbis. There would be far more unanimity and agreement. There might be some differences. There certainly would be differences with anti-Zionist Haredi communities, but what I'm describing is the up-the-middle committed Jews in America. Again, a small sample, but one I found the overlap was so striking. Confronted with congregants who were furious with them for not supporting Israel enough, for supporting Israel too much, or for supporting Israel at all. The congregants were responding to sermons. Congregants wanted to know what they thought, and then they were enraged when they expressed them. So I'm going to tell you about two very interesting examples of how two different rabbis, one Reform and one Conservative, tried to address a congregational issue. A Washington, D.C. Reform rabbi told me the following. 12 members, including a past president, publicly resigned, said I was too far to the right on Israel. A few days later, I met with a couple who said I was too far to the left and they would not leave the temple, but they would stop contributing to the temple until I became more supportive. On the night of a board of directors meeting of the temple, where the board was going to discuss how to address polarization and move forward, the synagogue received a bomb threat and they had to leave the synagogue and meet in a private home. They never found out who called in the bomb threat or why that happened. The Brooklyn rabbi explained after October 7th, 10 of her households quit from both the left and the right because of what I was saying. Each Shabbat, I was speaking for 30 minutes. People were clamoring for me to share my experiences. On the other hand, the next fall, 200 households joined her synagogue in Brooklyn, almost all of whom had never been affiliated with a synagogue. She's a very well-known social justice rabbi. Not a single rabbi I spoke with did not lose and gain members during this period of time, all attributed to the war in Gaza and Hamas's terrorism. So how did the two I tell you reach out about this? My job, one rabbi said, was to speak on behalf of the synagogue and make the tent as wide as possible. A rabbi from a smaller congregation explained how hard he worked to reach out to his congregants who were struggling very badly. So let me tell you now about the two very interesting cases. As one of the rabbis noted, the Reform rabbi from Washington, D.C., he said, we created listening circles. I learned that people wanted to shout at me. They wanted to proclaim things self-righteously. I heard, I want people to listen to me. I never heard a single person say, I want to listen. I thought to myself, uh-oh. It was a little familiar about my own behavior, I decided, though I've never been vociferous. His 700 membership unit congregation brought people together to do that. They had trained facilitators. They had 12 people in every different group. In every group, they figured out where they stood and they brought them together. 100 people signed up to participate. And what the rabbi concluded was that people actually knew so little about the history of Israel, about Zionism, about debates within Zionism at its founding, about anything about its founding, that he actually set up a curriculum to which people came to try to educate them and train them and get them to perhaps broaden their perspectives. The Brooklyn rabbi also created listening circles, but she had other outcomes in mind. She said, we engineered 3 listening circles to have multiple voices of people who we knew would disagree, but some who would agree with them, because she said we didn't want anyone to feel alone. Each person spoke for 2 minutes. It was followed by quiet, then the next person, and after 10 people, everyone sang nigunim, wordless melodies that are used in prayer. And it ended with Havdalah and people eating together. And she said, I would not allow anyone to come who would not stay to break bread together and spend time together. She said her aspiration, just like the other rabbi, was to get people to flex a muscle of listening and tolerating differences. And she said she heard an extraordinary range of people's feelings. Now, what I learned from this and felt so privileged, as any anthropologist does when they do any kind of fieldwork, was how these rabbis, how hard they worked to allow congregants and others to get together, to listen, to show compassion for other points of view, to even feel free to have complicated feelings. The word that came up more often than any in my speaking to people was how much the rabbis wished for nuance, to create nuanced conversations, to let people be together but listen to each other, to cope with what people often heard. And the rabbi in Manhattan told me a story that follows along with this about a student who, a college student who saw in social media, which of course no one should look at, a self-identified Jewish person who called for the murder of all Gazan Palestinians. And this rabbi counseled him, as did so many of the people in his congregation. Be more forgiving. Don't abandon your principles. Try to listen. And he put it in a really interesting way. He said the great danger, he believed, was from the extreme right and the extreme left. For him, the extreme right was Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was in the Netanyahu administration and who was a follower of Kahane, who served in the Knesset after having been jailed for extremism on many occasions. And Franz Fanon, which I'm sure many of you have heard of him, an Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist who was a Marxist philosopher of colonialism and the value of violence, and whose work is extremely important today to anti-colonial and settler colonialism. So what are my takeaways from alternative narrative 1? As of the 2020 population study of American Jews, 54% of Jews identify as conservative or reform. So we're really looking at people in the middle. Of course, the younger you are, the more likely you are to identify as Orthodox, or as, in the great social science term, nuns, and we don't mean Catholic nuns, but people who have no affiliation, but who are, in the Jewish case, just Jewish, or in other traditions, just spiritual, or just believe in God, but I never want to walk into fill in the blank, a church, a synagogue, or whatever. So we are in a very interesting moment because of how polarized the future seems to be coming. So in this anecdotal research, we learn that there is huge contest and conflicted view of Israel, its relationship to Palestine and Palestinians, for this Jews in the middle group. There are deep, deep generational divides about Israel. There are great vulnerabilities that Jews in America feel in the larger society, and an equally profound sense of fear and pain with other Jews. So mobilizing new views of Judaism and Jewish life, rejecting a Jewish state that is inclusive instead of Arab majority and Jewish minority, is yet one other version of what some people might call a kind of vitality that hasn't existed before. Now, these rabbis were not very certain, not one of them thought that people were suddenly going to send their children to day schools. Nobody thought people were coming to synagogue all that much more often any longer. Those kind of classic measures of Jewish participation did not, they thought, seemed around the corner. But what they identified that we see in the surge data is there is a tremendous longing among American Jews today for community, for belonging, and connection. Congregational life was one avenue of that vitality, but as you of course saw, full of conflict, full of difficulties, not knowing how to listen. And that tension and pull seems at the center of what has happened after October 7th. And I alluded to the fact that we need to pay attention to a second kind of vitality, though one that is certainly not nationally present, but is unquestionably growing. And the best example of that is a group that's called Jewish Voice for Peace. It was founded in 1969. It has grown in 2024 to 32,000 dues-paying members, but there are many, many people who identify with Jewish Voice for Peace who don't choose to pay dues. They are absolutely at the center of student campus protests from 2023 to the present. They have been removed from Washington University and Columbia and Barnard because of breaking university rules. But remarkably, the Columbia encampment's majority of students were Barnard undergraduates who were members of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is to say they were Jewish young women. And I know this because this observation is from my colleague, Professor Rebecca Coburn, very well-known Jewish historian, not only in Jewish studies and history, but she also was a member of the Antisemitism task force at Columbia University. And she has publicly said and put in writing that there were many, as you know, off-campus people involved in April 2024 in the encampments. But she said Jewish women from Barnard were the core of the encampments. A fact of life I could never have anticipated. So it's Jewish Voice for Peace is not just campus-oriented, but particularly in Brooklyn, where both of my daughters happen to live, but they are not part of these movements. People in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, not strongly aligned with other groups, are growing in great strength. So, for example, they identify as diasporists. There is a powerful intellectual tradition developing now with new publications and books about an Israel that is not Jewish, but is shared by other groups of which Jews will be a minority. That diaspora has a long intellectual tradition, that was parallel to Zionism in Europe and elsewhere. They belong to communities together. They celebrate Jewish holidays together. They interpret them in anti-Zionist ways, seders, Simchas Torah, a variety of things. For these Jews who have felt brutally excluded from Jewish life because they could not pledge allegiance to Zionism, they have found community. They have found a deeply meaningful Jewish life. And of course, traditional rabbis, scholars, federation types, they're never going to call this a vital view of Jewish life, but standing on the outside, as I think an anthropologist should, this is a powerful and growing movement among American Jews. So I want now to briefly talk about my second alternative narrative. It's about higher education, which we all know way too much about and have experienced, which has become the ground zero of all conflicts that have emerged since October 7th, and that have raised, I think, every important issue about free speech, about safety, about every possible thing, which I would have loved to talk to you about, but that was not my topic. But instead, I want to talk to you about something that it is less likely you've had any access to, and that you might just find very interesting, and you might want to go look at this research yourself. 3 excellent social scientists have produced survey research in late 2023 and 2024 from different projects. One, the Cone Center at Brandeis, which very actively does all kinds of research about American Jewish life, by a very interesting political scientist named Eitan Hirsch for a well-known Jewish educational foundation, the Jim Joseph Foundation, and another political scientist, a man named Robert Pape, who I don't know, who did this research at the University of Chicago. It's extremely compelling because Hirsch has been surveying some 50 campuses before October 7th, 2023. And so that's, forget the horrible events, but that for a social scientist is great because you can compare the impact of October 7th on the life of Jewish students and non-Jewish students who have been studied in this. So he put together something that's called the Pulse Survey, and then other social scientists get to use it and analyze it with different questions. At the University of Chicago, the Pape scholar, he had the Pulse work, but he also had research from NORC, which is a great research center at the University of Chicago, that has also been surveying students for quite a long time around attitudes, including about Jews. So if I can have the next slide. So, you know, unlike anthropologists, social scientists count things and study people and give them surveys from which you can learn a great deal. And people have been surveying anti-Semitic attitudes for a very, very long time. The Anti-Defamation League has done this for many, many decades. And they also do work on what is anti-Zionism. And it has stood the test of time, let's just say, the anti-Semitism research. If you answer yes to questions such as, do Jews control the media? Are Jews too powerful? Do Jews only care about themselves? I mean, it's just great what the questions are. You really could identify who I think we can safely call is an anti-Semite. And it's amazing which groups bat 1,000. It's pretty interesting. And they even know, if you answer yes to 3 of the questions, it means one thing. If you answer 5, it means something else. And now over time, they've also put in questions about anti-Zionism. And so this is how this survey research has been done for students, Jewish and non-Jewish. And I want first to just give you a little information about what the Cone Center at Brandeis found, if we can go to the next slide. This is not a handy little guide to very quickly get to see it, but I think the sidebar will help you. So what I'm going to tell you about is research about non-Jews, not Jews, as a way to try to make sense of what their attitudes are and what they are thinking about when they say certain things and what their attitudes might be. This research for the Cone Center, for Pape at Chicago, and above all for Eitan Hirsch in Boston, has been startling and surprising and not what was predicted. So what they are finding is that people who hold strongly anti-Zionist attitudes do not hold the classic anti-Semitic attitudes. Some, and some groups do for sure, but to a much, much more limited degree than any of them could have imagined. And you can see pretty much at a glance how those are different and how small a percentage are extremely hostile to both Jews and Israel. And I'm going to tell you why Hirsch thinks that is, which Brandeis didn't work on. So you have, this is broken out with very strong views that are anti-Israel and much, much, much weaker measures of, again, what you can know through survey research for what it's worth, which is about anti-Semitism. So do you want to look at this for about another 25 seconds before I move it? Because it's, I get it, it's pretty word dense, which sociologists don't usually like to do. So, okay, next slide. So this comes out of the University of Chicago study. The University of Chicago study was the only one that I found that studied both anti-Israel and anti-Islam attitudes on college campuses. It's amazing how little both groups were studied. You would think it might be kind of relevant to try to figure them both out. And so, to tell you again, this is a comparison to the general population, which NORC was helpful with. Oh no, which they got. The NORC ones, which are just Chicago-based, and then the Pulse study that I told you that came out of Boston. And from that, again, you can judge and see that there is only a very small overlap in anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiments from these students, again measured, I'm going to keep saying this, by attitude. Okay. And now I'm going to show you the third slide, which is the comparative one between how groups feel about Palestinians, about attitudes toward Jews, attitudes toward Muslims, attitudes toward supporters of Israel, and attitudes toward supporters of Palestinians. And they are querying different groups about this. And I was quite surprised at how parallel it was. And as I said, the PAPE study was the one that immediately after October 7th asked how both Jewish and Muslim students were feeling, how frightened they were, if they were afraid of physical violence, if they were having trouble concentrating on their schoolwork. And he found a 2% difference between Jews and Muslim students. The Jewish students were only 2% more traumatized than the Muslim students. Both groups were overwhelmingly traumatized. So the question is, Hirsch, whose graphic was so complicated, I just thought this is not worth it. So I'm just going to summarize it for you and take my word for it, and I'm happy to give you citations for all of these. So Hirsch did something different. He broke it out by your political perspective that started with socialist. I mean, he came up with every left-wing little flavor he could think of, and then alt-right, again, who so warmly visited you during Charlottesville, conservatives and libertarians. He found exactly what the Brandeis group found. The only group that was both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist was the extreme right wing. And here's what he found the most interesting, if not to say bedeviling, to think about. He said, left-wing students are anti-Zionist but not anti-Semitic. Alt-right students are the most anti-Semitic, including holding all Jews responsible for any action in Israel. Christian conservatives next, and then libertarians. As Hirsch concluded, The political categories do not hold as we imagined. What he was found, by the way, which was really fascinating, because these students felt the same before October 7th and after, that this alt-right extremist group, they feel the same way about Catholics. They hold Catholics responsible for anything that happens in the Vatican. I mean, you're seeing a very interesting extremist authoritarian way of viewing the world. And they're college students, which sets them apart in some interesting way. So my modest takeaway about Alternative 2 is that the campus remains an extremely complex setting for Jewish students. And if you want to talk about this during questions, I can tell you some of the things they found about that. Also for their families, also for institutions, for American political parties and groups. But what these scholars conclude is we just don't understand what the real attitudes are of the students who hold these views. And in fact, Pace, the University of Chicago study, asked people what they meant when they said from the river to the sea, and what Jewish students heard and what pro-Palestinian students thought they were saying were very, very different. And how did they know? Because they asked them instead of assuming it. So, my conclusions. Is American Jewish life more vital? American Jewish life has changed irrevocably since October 7th and not. The same fissures in American Jewish life persist. Generational differences are truly great among American Jews. Support for Israel among younger Jews dramatically has declined and seems to continue to be declining. What it means to be Jewish has changed dramatically over the last half century. And those things remain. But the depth of Jewish attachment, a deep sense of belonging to a people and a community, even one full of conflict, has emerged more forcefully than I think many of us could have imagined. And what that means at this time of massive polarization all around us in America and within Jewish life is something we just have to tune in and see. Thank you.
You're willing to take some? Yes, so please, if you have a question, raise your hand and let's.
Yes, Sam.
So thank you so much, Rev-Ellen. I wonder, do any of these surveys track attitudes towards assimilation or attitudes of what is considered assimilation? So I'll explain.
I mean, say more.
Okay.
Interesting, and because
Okay.
your problem is you think like an anthropologist.
Okay. That is one of the things I think that's radically misunderstood about the diasporist movements, right, that are Bundistan or neo-Bundistan, right, is that they understand themselves as anti-assimilationist, right, whereas they understand Zionism as an assimilationist movement, right, to become a nation like all the other nations of the world.
Right.
So this completely flips its head on commonsensical understandings of what Jewish identity and belonging is, that I think is radically misunderstood, that people become actually non- or anti-Zionist precisely because they don't want to assimilate, actually, to become just like their counterparts, right, or their parents,
Yeah.
right, that they view as assimilationists, actually. I'm just curious if there's any, it just sounds like the answer is no, that there's not data on this, but it strikes me as such an important piece of the puzzle that is just completely lost in so much of this discourse.
So Sam has raised such a profound issue. And, movements have thinkers who are not interested, so to speak, in how to solve problems and what to do with the people living in Israel and how they might work on that, but who are visionaries. And today there are many thinkers deeply despised by mainstream Jews, but with strong followings, who are trying to conceptualize a way to be Jewish, which, as Sam rightly characterized, as not as diasporist, refusing to assimilate to this traditional view of Zionism at the center of the world. Many of them are strong advocates for a return to Jewish study, to Jewish observance in ways that may be very inclusive of women, but may also move toward orthodoxy, which is quite different and in many ways very rejecting of nationalist and Zionist narratives. But what we're looking at this moment is on-the-ground movements, and some scholars. Our colleague Shaul Magid is somebody who has evolved as a thinker and has worked on this. Daniel Boyarin and Jonathan Boyarin, an anthropologist and a Talmudist. I mean, there are a growing number of people trying to conceptualize these issues. What that means in light of terrorism and other things that befell them, it's a splinter movement, there's no question. There's a publication called Jewish Currents, which was revived after being dormant for many years, that was a left-wing, even communist at some points, then anti-communist, that has a real following, that has many public events in Brooklyn, and has an ever-growing subscribership that has private foundation funding. So these are real strands, and I put them in my words today not to be quarrelsome, but to really be honest about the fact that there are competing strands for what Jewish life should look like after October 7th. Certainly before then, but even more so in the face of the trauma of that. So I thank you for asking that. Yeah.
Could you elaborate, you said it at the end, what the difference in Palestinians, the Jewish students, when the expression from the river to the sea means?
Right. So for Jewish students, they hear the erasure of Jewish life. For Palestinian students, in this survey, it just meant a right to live in this territory. They did not see it as the complete erasure or genocide or those issues. Now, you might take conflict with that or say that it's quite naive because that phrase has meant exactly that. And by the way, you should know that there are many people who believe that the government of Israel is engaged in trying to put Israel from the river to the sea, and that they are despoiling Palestinians of land and the West Bank and Gaza and others. But that's, again, survey research is very limited, but that's what they found when they asked people that question. Yeah.
I'm wondering about your observations about more urban areas versus small enclaves of Jews, in that it almost seems like a luxury item to be able to, to dispute certain realities. That, like, if you're in an urban area and there are lots of Jews, there's the whole variety of Jews, and you might be somewhere in the middle of
Right.
Jews. Whereas if you're like one of only a few Jews, you might sort of say, well, I need to take this perspective because, like, I don't feel so safe, or there aren't that many of us, or.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you asked that question. I confess I did, as I said, interview a Charlottesville rabbi who just had a hip replacement or a knee replacement, and that's exactly what he said. But what he said was, we have to stay together. He didn't see, it was an acknowledgement of how small the community was, and that didn't make it any less challenging for him or for his congregants. But you're right, it is one thing to be living in Brooklyn where you can find 700 or 800 anti-Zionists to hang around with at Passover. I mean, how many cities in the world can you say that, right? Or in the United States. So the more urban, the more diverse, it's true. But I would also say that people feel very strongly about their synagogues. And if you decide to leave, that can feel like you don't have a choice, and what will you do, and where will you affiliate, and will you just stop going, and other things. But there's no question that you could see it as a virtue of a smaller community that you have got to work it out because there are fewer choices. Again, I don't think that's made it easy, but you could not be more correct that, you know, you can choose, as people do, to just exit altogether. And if you're feeling lonely, why would you do that? So I feel like our audience is feeling the need to leave. You are all so polite. There's still, it appears to me, some small amount of food that, given the small audience, there would be enough for. I want to thank you all again for coming, even after Mr.